There is a room in Kingston, Jamaica, where fewer than 40 people are quietly deciding who gets to own half the earth. Not half of Jamaica, not half of the Caribbean, half of the entire planet. No cameras are allowed inside. No elected officials from London, Toronto, or New York are sitting at that table. And yet the decisions made in that room this year will decide who controls $20 trillion in metal, whether the ocean survives the next century, and whether small nations like Jamaica get to keep the one piece of global power they were never supposed to have. You have almost certainly never heard of this. That is not an accident. That is by design. The people with the most to gain from this story staying quiet have spent years making sure it stays buried under press releases about electric vehicles and green technology, framed as a story about innovation rather than what it actually is. A story about power, and about who gets to decide what happens to the one part of our planet that still, technically, belongs to everybody. By the time this video ends, you will understand why a tiny Caribbean island became the unlikely gatekeeper of the last unclaimed frontier on Earth, why the world's most powerful governments are suddenly desperate to get around Jamaica's authority, and why what happens in Kingston in the coming months will quietly reshape the balance of power between small nations and superpowers for generations. This is not a story about rocks. This is a story about who really rules the world when nobody is watching. Let's begin where almost nobody thinks to look, the bottom of the ocean. 4 kilometers beneath the surface of the Pacific, in a stretch of water between Hawaii and Mexico, so remote that more people have stood on the moon than have seen it with their own eyes, the seafloor is covered in something that looks like nothing at all. Dark, lumpy stones, roughly the size of a potato. If you found one on a beach, you would kick it aside without a second thought. But these are not ordinary stones. These are polymetallic nodules, and they may be the strangest objects most people have never heard of. Here is what makes them extraordinary. They grow. Not the way a tree grows or a coral reef builds itself upward. They grow the way a pearl grows inside an oyster, except impossibly slower. Dissolved metal in seawater settles, atom by atom, around a tiny core, perhaps a fragment of shark tooth or a sliver of ancient shell, and over unimaginable stretches of time a nodule is born. The growth rate is somewhere between 2 and 20 millimeters every million years. Sit with that for a second. Not every year, not every century, every million years. The nodule sitting on the seafloor right now, waiting to be scooped up by a robot the size of a house, began forming before a single human being walked upright on 2 legs. Some of them were already ancient before the first dinosaur took its first breath. And inside these unassuming gray stones is something that has turned them into one of the most contested objects on Earth: manganese, nickel, copper, and cobalt. The 4 ingredients at the very heart of the electric vehicle battery, the wind turbine, the solar storage system, and increasingly the modern defense industry. In other words, the raw material of the next 100 years of human technology is sitting on the ocean floor, disguised as garbage. One company alone, the Metals Company, claims that its licensed patch of seafloor in a region called the Clarion-Clipperton Zone contains enough battery metal to build close to 280 million electric vehicles. That is roughly the entire passenger car fleet of the United States sitting in the dark, 4 kilometers down, waiting for permission. We are not talking about a resource worth billions. We are talking about a resource that credible estimates place in the tens of trillions of dollars. And for most of human history it did not matter, because nobody could reach it. The pressure down there would crush a submarine like a soda can. The darkness is absolute, permanent, total. The kind of darkness that has never once in Earth's history been interrupted by a single ray of sunlight. The cost of operating machinery at those depths was, until recently, closer to science fiction than industry. That has now changed. Deep-sea robotics has caught up with ambition. And the explosive global demand for battery metal has caught up with the price tag required to make mining the abyss worthwhile. Picture the actual machine involved, because once you understand how mining these nodules would physically work, the scale of what is being proposed becomes much harder to ignore. A collector vehicle roughly the size of a combine harvester, reinforced to survive crushing pressure, crawls across the seafloor at something close to walking pace, perhaps half a kilometer an hour. As it advances, it uses powerful suction to vacuum up everything in its path, not just the nodules, but the top several inches of sediment, and every living creature small enough to be caught in that path along with it. The collected material is pumped upward through a riser pipe stretching kilometers from the ocean floor to a processing vessel waiting on the surface, an industrial hose connecting the abyss directly to daylight. To be commercially viable at all, an operation like this cannot run for a few hours a day. It has to run continuously, 24 hours a day, processing thousands of tons of seafloor material without pause for years at a time. This is not a careful surgical extraction of a few valuable rocks. This is industrial strip mining, deployed across one of the least understood environments our planet has ever produced. The gold rush the world has been quietly preparing for is no longer coming. It is already here. It is simply waiting for someone to open the gate. And the extraordinary part of this story, the part almost nobody outside of a handful of diplomats and scientists knows, is that the gatekeeper is not Washington. It is not Beijing. It is not the United Nations Security Council. It is a small, quiet institution headquartered in Kingston, Jamaica. If you asked 100 people on the street in London, Toronto, or New York which country regulates the ocean floor beneath international waters, not one of them would say Jamaica. And yet, for more than 3 decades, that is exactly the arrangement the world agreed to. It is called the International Seabed Authority, or the ISA, and it is one of the strangest, most consequential organizations most people have never heard of. Established under a United Nations treaty, headquartered permanently in Kingston, the ISA holds legal authority over roughly 54% of the surface of planet Earth. Not 54% of the ocean, 54% of the entire surface of our world. Because the deep seabed beyond national borders makes up more territory than every continent on Earth combined. Its mandate carries a phrase worth pausing on: the common heritage of humankind. Think about how rare that idea actually is. In a world carved up by borders, flags, and competing claims, the deep ocean floor was set aside as something different. Not property to be seized by whichever nation got there first with the biggest ship. Something that belonged, in theory, to every human being alive and to every human being not yet born. Rich nations and poor nations, landlocked countries and island nations, all holding equal legal standing in decisions about a resource none of them could physically reach on their own. For decades, this arrangement barely made headlines because barely anyone was capable of mining the deep sea in the first place. The ISA operated quietly, almost bureaucratically, negotiating rules for a mining industry that did not yet exist. Consider how unusual it actually is for an institution like this to exist at all. When the treaty establishing the ISA was negotiated, the nations involved understood something that gets lost in most modern conversations about global power: that some resources are simply too large, too consequential, and too permanent in their impact to be left to whichever nation happens to arrive first with the biggest fleet. The deep seabed does not belong to the country closest to it, because in most cases there is no country close to it at all. It sits in international waters, beyond every exclusive economic zone, beyond every national claim. So the treaty's authors did something rare in the history of international law. They created a shared authority, gave it real legal teeth, and placed its headquarters not in Washington, not in Brussels, not in Beijing, but in Kingston, Jamaica, a choice that at the time reflected genuine confidence in a small nation's capacity to steward something this significant on behalf of the entire world. That era is over. The ISA has become, almost overnight, one of the most consequential and most contested institutions on the planet because the technology to mine the deep sea finally caught up with the ambition to do it. And the fight over how, whether, and when that mining should begin is now playing out inside meeting rooms in downtown Kingston, watched closely by exactly the kind of people who understand what is actually at stake, and almost nobody else. Here is why that should matter enormously to you, wherever in the diaspora you are watching from tonight. For a small island nation like Jamaica, hosting an organization with this kind of legal authority is not a footnote. It is genuine geopolitical leverage, the kind that a country of under 3 million people almost never gets to hold over nations with populations in the hundreds of millions. When Kingston speaks in ISA proceedings, Washington, Beijing, and Brussels are forced to listen, because the rules being written in that Jamaican meeting room will determine who profits from trillions of dollars in metal. It is worth understanding briefly why Kingston specifically. When the treaty establishing the ISA was being finalized in the 1990s, Jamaica actively campaigned to host the headquarters, arguing that a developing nation, and specifically a Caribbean nation with deep historical ties to both the legacy of colonial resource extraction and the modern struggle for genuine sovereignty, was precisely the right to symbolic and practical home for an institution built on the idea that the ocean floor belonged to everyone rather than to whoever was strongest. That argument won. Jamaica secured the headquarters, and for 3 decades, an unglamorous but genuinely significant piece of global governance infrastructure has operated quietly out of Kingston, largely unnoticed by the rest of the world, right up until the moment the resource it governs became worth trillions of dollars. That is an extraordinary position for a Caribbean nation to occupy. And as you are about to see, extraordinary positions attract extraordinary pressure from people who would very much prefer that small nations did not have this kind of power at all. Before we go further into who is trying to bypass Jamaica's authority entirely and why, I want to ask something of you directly, because this channel exists specifically to bring you stories like this one, the ones that shape the world diaspora communities live in, but almost never make it into mainstream coverage. If you are Jamaican in London, Guyanese in New York, Trinidadian in Toronto, or from anywhere across our region, and you are tired of Caribbean stories being reduced to weather disasters and tourism adverts while stories of this magnitude go completely unreported, this channel is built for you. We are working toward 10,000 subscribers, and every single one of you watching right now, especially if you have been with us for more than one video, genuinely moves that number. If nobody has told you yet today, subscribing costs nothing, and it tells us to keep digging into the stories nobody else is covering. Now, let's get back into the room in Kingston, because what is happening there right now is nothing short of remarkable. Before we talk about the fight over who gets to mine the seabed, we need to be honest about something the mining industry would prefer you did not think too carefully about. What exactly are we proposing to destroy? For decades, marine scientists have been quietly documenting what actually lives on the abyssal plains targeted for mining, and what they have found has upended what we thought we understood about life on Earth. The deep sea is not, as mining companies like to suggest, an empty wasteland. It is one of the richest, strangest, least understood ecosystems our planet has ever produced. In a single survey of the primary mining target zone, scientists cataloged more than 5,000 distinct species. Nearly 90% of them had never been seen by human eyes before that survey. Not rare, not endangered, unknown, entirely new to science. Translucent sea cucumbers that drift like ghosts through the water column. Delicate glass sponges older than most nations on Earth. Creatures with no common name because no human being had ever needed to name them before. In 2025 alone, scientists identified 2 entirely new species living directly on these nodules, and in a moment of dark poetry, named them after the Greek deities of the underworld, fitting for creatures that exist in a world humans were never meant to see, in a place now scheduled for industrial extraction. Here is the detail that keeps marine biologists awake at night. Those nodules are not simply valuable rocks lying on dead ground. They are the habitat itself. They function like tiny apartment buildings on an otherwise featureless plain of mud, the only hard surface for thousands of square kilometers in any direction. Remove the nodules, and you are not simply harvesting a resource. You are demolishing the only foundation an entire ecosystem depends on to exist at all. Walk through what that actually means for the creatures involved, because it is easy to talk about biodiversity in the abstract, and much harder to picture what is genuinely at stake. Some of these organisms are stalked animals, anchored permanently to the surface of a single nodule for their entire lives, filtering food from the water the way a barnacle clings to a rock. Others burrow into the sediment surrounding the nodules, dependent on the specific chemistry those metal-rich stones create in the mud around them. Entire food chains, sponges feeding smaller organisms, those organisms feeding larger predators, are built around the simple presence of a hard surface in a place where hard surfaces should not exist at all. Take the nodule away, and you have not relocated an inconvenient. You have removed the only reason that particular patch of ocean floor supported life in the first place. And because these nodules take millions of years to form, the damage does not heal on any timescale a human being can meaningfully imagine. Scientists studying experimental mining tracks, cut into the seafloor more than 4 decades ago, have returned to find those scars still visible, the seafloor still largely lifeless in the exact tracks where machinery once passed, more than 40 years later. Other studies found that more than a quarter of a century after a single disturbance, certain species had simply never returned, not slower to return, never returned. An entire generation of marine biologists has now built careers studying test sites first disturbed in the 1970s and 80s, and the damage from those small-scale experiments, a fraction of the size any real commercial operation would require, is in some places still plainly visible on the seafloor today. We are not talking about damage that recovers in a human lifetime. We may be talking about damage that outlasts recorded human civilization itself. Then there is the part of this story that almost never makes it into the mining industry's glossy investor presentations: the plumes. When a mining collector vacuums the seafloor, it does not selectively lift only the nodules. It strips the top layer of sediment, along with every creature living in it, and pumps the resulting slurry up through a pipe stretching kilometers to a processing ship on the surface. The nodules are extracted. Everything else, the crushed remains of an ecosystem nobody had finished discovering, is pumped back into the water as waste, forming vast underwater clouds of fine sediment that drift for hundreds of kilometers on ocean currents. For a filter-feeding coral or sponge, an animal that survives by straining microscopic particles from clean water, being engulfed in one of these plumes is catastrophic. Feeding structures clog. Whatever faint light filters down from the surface is blotted out entirely. An area far beyond the actual mining site can be transformed from a living ecosystem into what scientists bluntly describe as a biological desert. There is a second kind of pollution here that almost never comes up in these conversations, and it may matter just as much as the physical destruction. The deep ocean is not the silent void most of us imagine. It carries sound in ways the surface world does not: whale song traveling across entire ocean basins, dolphins echolocating, fish communicating in frequencies humanity has only recently learned to detect at all. Into that acoustic world, an industry built on 24-hour mining machinery would introduce constant grinding, humming, and clanking, a permanent mechanical presence in an environment that has never once, in all of geological history, contained anything like it. For species that navigate, feed, and find one another almost entirely through sound, that kind of unrelenting noise pollution could render enormous stretches of ocean effectively uninhabitable long before a single nodule from that area is ever physically removed. And there is one more layer to this most people never consider. The deep ocean is one of the largest carbon sinks on the planet. When organisms near the surface die, they sink, carrying carbon with them into the deep, where it can remain locked away for centuries. This quiet, largely invisible process helps keep our entire climate system in balance. Large-scale disruption of the seafloor risks interfering with a mechanism we do not yet fully understand in the name of extracting metal meant to fight climate change, destroying part of the planet's climate system to save another part of it. That is the uncomfortable irony sitting at the center of this entire industry. More than 950 marine scientists and ocean policy experts worldwide have now signed formal statements calling for a pause on deep-sea mining. Not a permanent ban in most cases. A pause. Time to actually understand what we are proposing to destroy before the machines start running. As of the most recent count, close to 40 national governments have echoed that call, ranging from small Pacific Island states to established European nations. The blunt, uncomfortable truth is this: humanity currently understands the surface of Mars in more scientific detail than we understand our own ocean floor, and several of the world's most powerful economic interests are preparing to begin industrial-scale extraction there anyway. Which brings us to the fight now unfolding in Kingston, because the rules meant to prevent exactly this kind of reckless extraction are stuck, and one very powerful nation has just decided it is done waiting for permission. Before we move into the political fight over Jamaica's authority, it is worth pausing to ask a simple question that gets skipped far too often in coverage of this story. Who exactly stands to profit if the deep sea opens to mining, and how much are they willing to spend to make that happen? The metals company did not appear out of nowhere. It has spent well over a decade and hundreds of millions of dollars positioning itself as the frontrunner in this industry, securing exploration contracts, commissioning environmental studies designed to support its own case, and lobbying aggressively at every level of the ISA negotiating process. Its public pitch is polished and deliberately reassuring. Precision robotics, minimal footprint, a cleaner alternative to the undeniable horrors of some land-based cobalt mining, much of which relies on dangerous, poorly regulated labor conditions in Central Africa. That comparison is not entirely dishonest. Land-based mining for battery metals genuinely does carry serious human and environmental costs, and it would be intellectually lazy to pretend otherwise. But notice the framing being offered. The choice is presented as though it only has two options: destructive mining on land, or supposedly gentler mining in the deep sea. That framing conveniently leaves out every alternative that does not involve mining anything new at all. Alternatives we will return to shortly. Behind the public relations campaign sits a straightforward financial reality. Companies positioned to win the first licenses in a newly opened deep-sea mining industry stand to gain access to a resource base worth trillions of dollars, effectively for the price of navigating a regulatory approval process. That is an extraordinary incentive to move quickly, to apply pressure wherever pressure can be applied, and to search for any legal pathway, ISA approved or otherwise, that gets machinery into the water sooner rather than later. Understanding that financial incentive does not mean assuming bad faith from every person involved in this industry. It simply means understanding why the pressure on institutions like the ISA has become so intense so quickly, and why an American executive order bypassing that institution entirely arrived at precisely the moment it did. It also helps explain the investor pressure sitting quietly behind the scenes. Publicly listed mining ventures answer to shareholders who expect returns, and years of stalled ISA negotiations without a finished mining code have meant years of investors waiting on a return that has not yet materialized. That kind of financial pressure does not stay patient forever. At some point, waiting for an international body to finish a rulebook becomes less attractive than finding or creating an alternative legal pathway that gets the same result faster, regardless of whether that pathway commands the same broad international legitimacy. That is precisely the dynamic that produced the executive order bypassing the ISA in the first place, and it is a dynamic that is not going away simply because one particular application gets challenged. For more than a decade, the ISA's member nations have been negotiating what is known as the Mining Code, the rulebook that would set binding environmental standards before a single commercial mining operation could legally begin. In theory, it is the safeguard standing between the seabed and industrial extraction. In practice, the negotiations have moved at a pace that can only be described as deliberately, almost paralyzingly slow, because the scientific and ethical questions involved are genuinely enormous. How do you regulate the destruction of an ecosystem you have barely begun to study? Then, in 2021, the tiny Pacific nation of Nauru, population smaller than most university campuses, did something that changed the entire trajectory of this story. By sponsoring a mining company and invoking an obscure legal mechanism buried in the treaty, Nauru triggered what is known as the 2-year rule. The clock started ticking. Either the ISA finalized binding mining regulations within 2 years, or member nations would be legally obligated to consider commercial mining applications anyway, rules or no rules. That deadline passed in 2023. A revised target for 2025 also came and went. As of today, the mining code still is not finished. Meaningful environmental protections are still not formally in place. And yet, technically, under the letter of the treaty, mining companies may now be entitled to apply for commercial licenses regardless. The lock on the gate is, for all practical purposes, broken. And the very institution built to say no is no longer entirely certain it still has the legal standing to say it. Into that uncertainty walked the United States. And what happened next is where this story stopped being a slow-moving bureaucratic negotiation and became a genuine international confrontation. In April 2025, the White House signed an executive order designed to fast-track American deep-sea mining, deliberately bypassing the ISA framework entirely. Here is the detail that makes this so extraordinary. The United States has never even ratified the treaty that created the ISA. It is not a member. It has no vote in Kingston's negotiations. And yet, relying on a decades-old piece of domestic legislation from 1980, originally written long before deep-sea mining was commercially realistic, the American government began asserting the authority to license mining operations in waters the rest of the world considers the common heritage of all humankind. The metals company, the same firm that had spent years waiting on the ISA to finalize its rules, seized the opening almost immediately, applying directly to the United States government for commercial mining permits, effectively attempting to walk around the entire international system Jamaica had spent 30 years helping to build and safeguard. The reaction inside the ISA was immediate and severe. Delegations from across Africa and beyond formally condemned the move as a direct violation of international law. The ISA Council opened a formal investigation in the summer of 2025. The company now faces the real possibility of losing its existing exploration contracts entirely. But strip away the legal language, and what you are left with is a much simpler, much more uncomfortable question. If the most powerful nation on Earth can simply decide the rules do not apply to it, and act unilaterally anyway, what does that say about every other international agreement small nations depend on to have any voice at all? This is no longer a dispute about deep-sea mining regulations. It has become a test of whether the very idea of shared global resources means anything when a superpower decides it is inconvenient. This is where the story most documentaries stop telling picks back up, because the confrontation did not end with that executive order. It escalated, and it escalated in the very room we opened this video talking about. In March 2026, the ISA Council convened in Kingston for the first part of its 31st session, 9 intensive days of closed-door negotiation on the draft regulations that will eventually govern commercial exploitation of the seabed. Delegates worked through incentive structures, environmental cost royalties, and pilot mining frameworks, the unglamorous, granular detail that determines whether an eventual mining industry operates responsibly or recklessly. A new council president was elected. Progress was made on paper. But here is the part that matters most, and the part almost no international outlet bothered reporting to a diaspora audience. That March session, by the ISA's own admission, failed to deliver several of the key outcomes negotiators had hoped for. The mining code remains unfinished. The fundamental disagreements between nations pushing to accelerate mining and nations demanding a precautionary pause remain unresolved, which means the confrontation is not settled. It is paused, mid-fight, with the second half of this year's council session scheduled to reconvene in Kingston in July, immediately ahead of the ISA's full assembly session later that same month. In other words, as you are watching this video right now, the exact confrontation we have spent this entire story describing small island nations and the common heritage principle on one side, a superpower attempting to write its own rules on the other, is actively unresolved, actively being negotiated in meeting rooms in Kingston, Jamaica. This year, there has also been a subtle but significant shift in how this industry is being justified publicly, one worth pausing on. The conversation has quietly expanded beyond green energy. Increasingly, policy documents and government statements frame these seabed metals not simply as electric vehicle components, but as strategic materials essential to national defense and military competition, particularly in the context of rivalry with China. Battery metal is no longer only about electric cars. It is now openly discussed in terms of missile systems, advanced electronics, and military supply chains. That reframing matters enormously, because a resource justified purely on environmental grounds can be debated on environmental terms. Someone can reasonably argue that a cleaner battery chemistry or a better recycling program solves the same problem without the same cost. But a resource reframed as a matter of national security tends to get pursued regardless of the environmental cost, and regardless of whose legal authority stands in the way, because no government wants to be the one that let a strategic rival secure a critical resource first. That is precisely the kind of argument that has, throughout history, justified nations bypassing international agreements they had previously signed on to willingly. China, for its part, has spent years quietly building its own capacity in exactly this space, both through state-linked mining exploration contracts already held with the ISA, and through dominance of the processing side of the battery metal supply chain, the refineries and factories that turn raw nodules into usable material. Much of the American urgency now driving unilateral action traces directly back to a fear of falling behind in that race, which means the deep seabed has quietly stopped being purely an environmental or even purely an economic question. It has become another front in the broader competition between the world's largest powers, with Jamaica's institutions sitting, almost accidentally, directly in the middle of it. Jamaica quietly has become the meeting point of both of those pressures at once. So here is the question worth asking directly. If you are watching this from London, New York, Toronto, Miami, or anywhere else our diaspora has built a life far from home, why should any of this matter to you personally today? Because this is not simply an environmental story. It is a story about whether small nations retain any genuine power in a world increasingly run by whoever is willing to ignore the rules first. For decades, our region has watched larger powers write the terms of engagement on trade, on debt, on migration policy, on climate financing, while island nations were left to accept whatever arrangement the world's major economies decided was fair. The ISA, headquartered in Jamaica, holding legal authority over more than half the surface of the earth, was one of the rare exceptions. A structure where a small Caribbean nation held genuine institutional power over an issue the largest economies on the planet could not simply override by force. Watching a superpower attempt to walk around that authority entirely is not an abstract legal dispute happening somewhere far away. It is a direct test of whether the post-war idea that small nations deserve an equal seat at the table still means anything at all in 2026. If the United States or any other major power succeeds in bypassing Jamaica's authority here, the precedent will not stay contained to the ocean floor. It tells every powerful nation watching that international agreements only bind you until they become inconvenient, and that the institutions small nations depend on for leverage can simply be ignored by whoever has enough force to do it. That should matter to every single person watching this who has ever felt like the countries we come from get talked over, rather than talked to, on the world stage. Think about how this actually plays out in practical terms for the wider Caribbean and for Jamaica specifically. Hosting the ISA brings the country genuine, tangible benefits beyond prestige, diplomatic weight in negotiations far larger than its own economy, a permanent seat at the center of a conversation involving the world's largest mining companies and governments, and a small but meaningful stream of international relevance that a nation of Jamaica's size rarely gets to command on its own. If that authority is quietly hollowed out by nations simply choosing to act outside it whenever it becomes inconvenient, Jamaica does not just lose influence over deep-sea mining policy. It loses part of the argument, made consistently by Caribbean leaders for decades, that small nations deserve genuine standing in the institutions that govern the world's shared resources, whether that is the ocean floor, climate financing, or global trade rules. Every time a more powerful nation successfully demonstrates that international agreements are optional the moment they become inconvenient, it becomes a little easier for the next power to do exactly the same thing in a different arena over a different resource, whether that is Caribbean fishing rights, regional debt negotiations, or climate reparations discussions our leaders have been pushing for years. There is also a genuinely difficult, honest question underneath all of this that deserves more attention than it usually receives, and I want to be straightforward with you about it rather than pretend the answer is simple. Do we actually need to mine the deep ocean at all? Mining companies will tell you the answer is an unqualified yes, that global battery demand leaves no realistic alternative. But that framing deserves real scrutiny, because there are credible alternatives currently receiving a fraction of the investment and attention that deep-sea mining is. Battery recycling technology remains dramatically underdeveloped relative to its potential. The overwhelming majority of lithium batteries currently reach the end of their life and are never properly recycled at all, representing an enormous, largely untapped supply of exactly the metals mining companies claim are scarce. Consider what that actually means in practice. Every electric vehicle sold over the past decade will eventually need its battery replaced or retired, and every one of those retired batteries is, in effect, a small deposit of exactly the metal sitting 4 kilometers beneath the Pacific. Right now, most of that deposit ends up in landfill or storage, not because recovering it is impossible, but because building the recycling infrastructure to do it at scale has never received anywhere near the investment or political urgency that deep-sea mining has. New battery chemistries, sodium-ion designs among them, are advancing quickly and could sharply reduce global dependence on cobalt and nickel altogether within the coming decade. And a genuine shift toward a circular economy, where products are engineered from the outset to be repaired and recycled rather than discarded, could reduce raw material demand in ways that never require touching the ocean floor at all. None of these alternatives are perfect. None of them alone solve the problem entirely. But it is worth asking, honestly and without cynicism, who benefits most from a narrative insisting there is no other option besides tearing open the deep sea. Frequently, it is the companies that stand to profit most directly from doing exactly that. There is also a broader question worth raising here, one that rarely gets asked in mainstream coverage of the green energy transition at all. Does solving climate change actually require replacing every single petrol car on Earth with an electric equivalent, each one requiring its own fresh supply of newly mined battery metal? Or could meaningful investment in public transportation, walkable urban design, and simply consuming less also form part of a serious climate strategy, one that reduces the raw demand for new mining altogether rather than searching for ever more remote and fragile places to extract from? The solution to a resource-intensive problem is not always to find a new frontier to extract from. Sometimes it is to genuinely question how much extraction the problem actually requires in the first place. That is a harder, less profitable conversation for any single company to have, which may be exactly why it gets raised so rarely. As of this year, the applications are already filed. The machinery already exists, built and tested, waiting on permission rather than technology. The companies are positioned and ready to move the moment the legal path clears, whether that path runs through Kingston or around it entirely. The single greatest obstacle standing between the deep ocean and full industrial extraction right now is not a shortage of scientific concern. It is a shortage of public awareness and political pressure, precisely the gap this video exists to help close. There are concrete things worth knowing and doing here, and I want to walk through them directly rather than leave this vague. Understand who stands where in this fight and why. Some of the world's largest technology and automotive companies, including BMW, Volvo, Google, and Samsung, have already publicly pledged not to use deep-sea minerals in their supply chains, a meaningful signal that consumer and shareholder pressure genuinely does shift corporate behavior when applied consistently. Organizations such as the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition continue tracking these negotiations closely and publishing regular, detailed updates as the July Kingston session approaches. If you live in a nation that holds membership in the ISA, your government holds an actual vote in exactly the negotiations we have spent this video describing. Contacting a representative and stating plainly that you are informed and that you care how your government votes on this is a small action, but it is one of the only direct levers an ordinary citizen actually has over a decision of this magnitude. Here is the deeper question this entire story is really asking, and it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Is the convenience of our current technology genuinely worth the permanent, irreversible loss of an ecosystem we have barely begun to understand? One that took longer to form than human civilization has existed. And separately, does a superpower deciding unilaterally that international law no longer applies to it the moment that law becomes inconvenient represent the kind of precedent the rest of the world, and especially small nations like ours, can actually afford to accept without resistance? Jamaica is sitting, quite literally, on top of one of the most consequential decisions of this century, not because of what lies beneath its own shores, but because of the institution it has hosted quietly for 30 years. The fairy tale version of this story would call it a treasure chest. But unlike the fairy tales, this treasure comes with a genuine curse attached. Once it is open, there is no closing it again. Every past era of resource extraction on this planet has followed a familiar pattern. Move fast, extract value, worry about the consequences later once the profits have already been counted and the damage is already permanent. Coal, oil, rainforest timber. In every case, the warnings came from scientists and were dismissed as overly cautious, right up until the damage became undeniable and irreversible. The deep sea is, in a very real sense, the last major frontier where that pattern has not yet fully played out, where the warnings are arriving before the extraction rather than after it. Whether humanity actually listens this time for once remains to be seen. And the answer is being written right now in real time in meeting rooms in Kingston. The gold rush is real. The machinery is ready. The council reconvenes in Kingston this July. And what gets decided there, or fails to get decided there, will echo for longer than any of us will be alive to witness the consequences. And now at least you know it is happening. If this is the kind of story you wish more people in our community were talking about, the deep, researched, consequential stories that actually shape the world our families live in, rather than another surface-level headline, do two things for me right now. Subscribe, because we are building toward 10,000 of you who actually care about substance over noise, and it genuinely moves the needle when you do it today rather than later. And leave a comment answering this honestly. If a country the size of Jamaica can be quietly pushed aside on a decision this consequential, what does that tell us about how much real power small nations actually hold on the world stage? And what, if anything, can people like us watching from London, from Brooklyn, from Toronto, actually do about it? The ocean does not have a seat at the negotiating table in Kingston. It has no vote, no delegation, no voice of its own, but we do. And it starts with paying attention to rooms most of the world has never thought to look inside. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one.